Hi there, I'm Robert Poyton. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm taking my first look at fantasy gaming. As I mentioned in a previous episode, I was an avid reader as a kid, well, still am, and one of the type of books that interested me was fantasy. So of course I read The Hobbit, The Chronicles of Narnia, and another series that I remember that doesn't seem to get much attention these days were the books by Alan Garner. I think the first one was called The Weird Stone of Brisingamen, which I actually reread fairly recently and was pleasantly surprised at how well it held up after all these years. So excellent series. As I got a bit older, I read Lord of the Rings. I think I probably tried to read The Silmarillion at some point, but never really got that far into it, and it's something I should go back to. But at some point in the mid-70s, my dad brought home this book to read, Conan the Adventurer, with that iconic Frazetta cover. This actual book, so this is a very well thumbed copy, and that got me into reading sword and sorcery and other types of fantasy. So of course from there I started reading Fritz Leiber, Farfod and the Grey Mouser, Moorcock's Elric, and so on and so on. Now, when I got into gaming, it was only natural that those two worlds would collide, so to speak. So one of the first types of gaming we did was tabletop Middle-earth. 25mm figures. There wasn't a lot of choice around at that time. I think these figures here are mostly minifigs. But of course, as the fantasy boom sort of happened, particularly when D&D came in, then there was a lot more variety of miniatures coming out. At that time, or about the same time that D&D came out, I also had a couple of board games based on the Battle of Five Armies and the War of the Ring, which I'm going to talk about in another episode entitled Board of the Rings. What else? But if we stick to tabletop gaming, or at least using miniatures, I think there's three types of fantasy game that I've enjoyed. The first one is those mass battles, those big tabletop battles. The second one is smaller sort of skirmish type games, and the last one would be of course the role-playing games, mainly Dungeons and Dragons, though we played a little with Tunnels and Trolls and one or two other things. But I think as a system it's hard to beat D&D for good old-fashioned hack and slash fantasy role-playing. So when I looked to get back into gaming, I thought it would be great to pick up that 25mm fantasy again, so I started looking around for some other rules, and there were quite a few. I've got a set called Reaper, which are a very famous set of rules, and I think they might have formed the basis of the later Warhammer rules. I'm not too sure of that, but I think they sort of evolved into Warhammer. But there were quite a few other things around as well. So for example, Armies of Arcana. This is a set of rules published by Thanes Games. These are a little more up to date, 1998 I think, American rules, and these are not so specific in terms of setting. Basically with this set of rules you can have sort of whatever armies you want. You can have undead armies or orc armies, or it's not just tied into one sort of setting. This works for 15mm or 25mm, and I've not played these. I've not really had a chance to look through them in too much depth, but again they look like a good solid set of rules. And at the back we've got army lists for all the different troop types: dwarves, dark elves, sylvan elves. There seems to be a lot of different types of elves in these games. Goblins, barbarians, samurai, so there's different types of human troops as well. And of course magic is an important part of any fantasy game, so we've got quite comprehensive lists of spells as well, and they're put into different categories. So we've got life spells, death spells, nature spells, chaos spells, earth spells, and so on. So a nice wide range, because again, if you're not working in a particular setting, of course, then your magic system can be a little more flexible. So overall, as I say, I've not really tried those out yet, but on first glance they look like a good set of rules. Another set of well-regarded rules were Hordes of the Things, and maybe to the surprise of some, these were put out by the Wargames research group. This edition is from 2002, but these were originally published in the 90s, I think. Oh yeah, 1991. So this was Phil Barker, and of course the WRG were much better known for putting out historical rules, ancients, Second World War, that kind of thing. And again, these are not tied into any particular setting. The actual mechanics look quite similar to historical rules in terms of basing the figures, how you move them, frontage, formation, that kind of thing. But of course you also have the addition of magic again, and I think there's, in fantasy games, you get that element of one-to-one heroic combat as well, because, you know, if your unit's being led by an Aragorn or a King Arthur or that kind of thing, then there's that slightly more individual element. I guess you could have that in historical games, but we tend not to see it so much. There's also very detailed army lists here, so it starts with sort of like a generic elf army or dwarf or orc or gnome, and then it goes on to quite specific things. So an army that draws on Sumerian myth, for example, or Greek myth, or Amazonian or Homeric, even Kung Fu. So a lot of scope to have different types of battles in pretty much whatever setting you want. Indian myth, and they also feature one of the mainstays of fantasy fiction, of course, Robert E. Howard's Conan. We also have a list here for a Hyborian setting, and that brings me on nicely to my next set of rules. So if your wargame setting is Middle Earth, then of course you're restricted to the types of troops you can have. It's going to be Rangers, Knights of Dol Amroth, groups of Orcs, Haradrim, that kind of stuff. Now you can often, and sometimes we did, get away with using historical figures, but of course for things like Orcs or very specific units like Guards of Minas Tirith, you needed quite specific figures. But when it comes to gaming in something like the Hyborian Age, things get a little bit easier, because of course Howard in his stories drew a lot on existing historical civilizations. So we know that the Aquilonians, for example, can be represented to some extent by medieval knights. The Stygians can be ancient Egyptians. The Vanir can be Vikings, and so on and so on. So back then it was a lot easier to put an army together for that setting, because you could just buy historical figures, and obviously you can adapt them a little bit, give them different banners, that kind of stuff. This set of rules, Royal Armies of the Hyborian Age, was put out by Fantasy Games Unlimited in 1975, and one of the authors, Ling Carter, was a very well-known fantasy author, and is one of those people responsible, along with Elsprague de Camp and others, for bringing Conan back into notice, really, and getting those Conan stories published in the 70s. And this was one of those settings that we always heard about, but of course back in those days I remember looking for these rules and not being able to find them anywhere. So I was very pleased when I got back into gaming. I had a little search around online and I found a set of these original rules for sale for about 20 quid. I think it was someone in Italy, so they came over from Italy. And as I said, these were published in 1975 by Fantasy Games Unlimited. And I suppose these are pretty much what you call old school rules. Again, they draw heavily on the mechanics for historical games, because it's all the same type of troop types, generally light infantry, medium infantry, heavy infantry, mammoths, chariots, and so on. So a lot of the mechanics are the same as you'd have in a medieval or ancient setting. We have rules on morale, as you'd expect, but this being fantasy, as we mentioned earlier, we also get that aspect of heroes and commanders. So this is where one particular individual can have a big influence on the battle. And of course, as we'd expect in a fantasy setting, we get rules on magic as well. But these reflect the original stories very nicely, because although of course there is magic and magicians or wizards and sorcerers in the Conan stories, they tend to be not as powerful as people like your Gandalfs or your Witch Kings. So the use of magic, particularly on the battlefield, is quite limited, and these rules reflect that very nicely. From there we get advice on setting up campaigns, and then we finish with details of troop types, and in particular how to paint them up. And then one last thing you get in these rules as well is a rather nice map of Hyboria, or at least Hyboria as it stood in Conan's time. So this is after the oceans drank Atlantis, but before the rise of the sons of Arius. So just one more set of tabletop rules to look at, because another thing, of course, is when you're working in 25mm, which was pretty much all that was available back in the day. If you're having a mass battle, that's a lot of figures to paint, it's a lot of figures to base and move around, and of course, most of the miniatures back then were metal as well, so it could be quite expensive. So another alternative was to go 1/300th scale, 6mm. So Firestorm, this is a set of rules for fantasy, but specifically for 1/300th scale. So this is put out by Martin David James Publications, and is the copyright of the Brigantian Wargames Society. I can't find any publication date in these, so I'm not sure how new or old they are. So it's all pretty much the same type of mechanics again: movement, heroes, combat, missile fire, morale, and again, as this is not specific to any one setting, there's a much more extensive range of magic spells as well. So more in common with the Armies of Arcana rules, where you can build up your own armies of whatever type you like. And of course, again, at the back we get lots of army lists and points values. So what do we got here? Human, men-at-arms, dwarves, elves. Although, you know, there's different settings, most people seem to fall back on the same races, really. It's normally human, elf, orc, goblin, halflings, woodland creatures, centaurs, giants, ogres, trolls. So again, your pretty typical fantasy stuff. So that isn't a set of rules I've tried. I was thinking about 1/300th figures at some time, just to be able to do those big battles, but just recently something else came along. So yeah, just a few weeks back at Bedford Gladiators on a Monday night, I noticed there was a fantasy battle going on, and it was using 10mm figures, which I'd never seen before. Obviously seen 25mm, 15mm and 6mm used for battles, but not 10mm. And that looks like a nice scale, because of course with 6mm it's not so bad if you're using armour or planes or that kind of thing, but for individual figures it's not so good. 10mm seems like a nice compromise. You can still see what the figure is, you can get a bit of painting on it, but it allows you to field those bigger armies. It was Neil running the game, and the rules he was using were something called War Master Revolution, not something I'm at all familiar with, so I've ordered up a set of those, and that will probably be the scale I'm going to start getting back into for my tabletop fantasy battles. And of course we'll follow that on the channel. When I get my first armies in, we'll do an unboxing, and then I'll go through the painting, etc., and look at getting a battle report in as soon as I can. I did mention skirmish level games as well, because that's something we used to do back in the day, so I thought that would be another good one to revive again. And of course for that you can use 25mm figs. You only need sort of a dozen figures per side or per player or whatever it is. But again, there's the question of rules. We had a very good set of homebrew rules back in the day, and the sort of games we used to set up involved 4 or 5 players, each controlling a small group, and each group would have its own specific objectives. Sometimes those objectives were opposed to each other, sometimes they coincided. So with that type of game you had a lot of scope for bargaining and double dealing and backstabbing the other players as well. So I thought I'd look around and see if I could find some good fantasy skirmish rules that would allow me to set that sort of game up. I've looked around at a few. Advanced Song of Blades and Heroes is quite a nice set, but what I found with all of these rules is they're pretty much just for 2 players. The 2 players oppose each other, so you're missing out on that interaction between these different groups. So what I'm going to do is look around at all these sets of rules, see if I can dig out somewhere, because I might still have them somewhere in the depths of the shed, those old rules, and then probably get together a homebrew set for that type of fantasy skirmish game. So it will be interesting to see how a set of rules develops from scratch. Well, I say from scratch, it's not like I'm particularly making anything up original, because I'm going to be drawing on a lot of sources, but nonetheless you need to bring all these things together in a cohesive way. So I look forward to seeing how that's developing and getting into some play testing, and fingers crossed we'll end up with a good playable game. And also, of course, do let me know if you know of any fantasy skirmish set that has that setup where you can have multiple players opposing each other. I'd be very interested to hear. The thing that is the stumbling block the most for me is this idea that in a lot of modern war games you have to activate units, whereas before it used to be you go, I go, or simultaneous movement. So this idea of activation is quite new to me. That's something I'm going to have to get to grips with. Anyway, those are going to be the 2 main projects coming up on the fantasy episodes here. If you have any ideas, comments or suggestions, please do let me know. And of course, please do like, share and subscribe. Take care.